It began with the smallest sound. Not the scream you might expect to signal the undoing of a life, not the crash of glass or the tearing of fabric, but a single uneven creak deep within the bones of the house. A sound so ordinary, it should have dissolved into the dark without consequence, but it didn't. It held. It carried. It seemed to wait. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. Margaret Loring lay in bed, her body still under the weight of half-sleep, her eyes fixed on the ceiling where shadows from the elm outside shifted with the wind. She told herself it was nothing, just the winter air contracting the old wood, but she knew this house too well. It had its own rhythm, its own voice. This sound didn't belong. The wind outside hissed through the bare branches, rattling them against the siding in a way she had always found oddly comforting, like a familiar lullaby. But beneath that steady whisper was something else, the subtle, careful press of a footstep placed to avoid notice. She breathed slowly, shallowly, straining to hear more. Nothing came. Still she rose. The floor was cold under her bare feet, and the boards gave softly in places she knew by heart. She moved down the hallway, the darkness thick and layered, smelling faintly of the lemon oil she'd used on the furniture earlier that week. She stopped at the children's door. The handle was cold, too cold, as if the metal had been left in the night air. She turned it slowly, wincing at the faint click of the latch, and eased the door open. Her breath caught. The room looked wrong. Not messy, not ransacked, but wrong in its order. Beds perfectly made, sheets smooth, as if ironed pillows centered blankets folded with deliberate precision. Not a toy on the floor, not a sock hanging from the bed frame, not the faint clutter of life she was used to finding no matter how many times she tidied. It was a room no one had lived in for weeks. Her voice was low, hesitant, as if speaking too loudly would make it true. Samuel, silence. Jonah, nothing. Ruth. The air didn't answer. She stepped further in her eyes, darting from bed to bed to the little desk where Ruth's hairbrush used to sit, to the window where Samuel had taped a paper snowflake last month. The tape was still there. The snowflake was gone. The closet door stood open. Empty. She turned slowly toward the hallway, her heartbeat in her ears, her tongue dry in her mouth. She checked the bathroom, the linen closet, the other bedrooms. No children. Her voice rose, calling them again, louder now, bouncing down the hallway and back to her like the house itself was mocking her. She tried the front door, locked from the inside. The back door too. Jackets still hung neatly on their hooks. Shoes still lined up by size. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone. The dial tone hummed in her ear, steady and indifferent, as she punched in the numbers. By the time the first neighbor came out, she was standing in the driveway, barefoot in the snow, her nightgown clinging to her legs and the wind tangling her hair. Her voice was raw from shouting their names. Snow fell slow and heavy, each flake settling on her skin like the touch of a hand she couldn't see. She didn't feel the cold. She felt only the hollow, widening space where her children should have been. The night swallowed sound in a way Margaret had never noticed before. Not just quiet hollow. The operator's voice had been clipped and calm, and now those instructions, stay where you are. Don't touch anything, rang in her ears like something religious, a ritual she. Through the thin curtains, she caught sight of the police car's headlights gliding silently up the long gravel drive. The beam catching the low branches of the elms, each leaf briefly flashing silver, before falling back into. When the knock came, it wasn't the kind you see on television, not the sharp, authoritative thud, but a hesitant rap, almost apologetic. 2 officers, a man and a woman, stepped inside, brushing rain from their coats. The air seemed to change temperature around them, a faint scent of damp wool mixing with the dry, dusty scent of the old farmhouse. Their voices were low, but steady, and almost too steady, as if the way they spoke could keep reality from turning into something unmanageable. They asked when Margaret had last seen her sister. Had she left the property? Was she known to wander? The questions felt mechanical, each answer passing through their notebooks without Levy. The search began small, the downstairs rooms first. The officers moved with a methodical patience that made the walls seem closer, the ceilings lower. Margaret watched the beam of their flashlights slice through the dim corners of the living room. Over the shelves across the worn fabric of the couch, where her sister had napped just yesterday afternoon, one of them called her name softly. Not her sister's name, Em. As in her sister's bedroom, the bed was neatly made too neatly. The police opened drawers, lifted the edge of the quilt, glanced under the bed. A faint smell of lavender hung in the air from the sachets her sister always kept in the linen. Nothing disturbed, nothing missing, except her. It was when Margaret stood in the doorway, staring at the far wall, that she noticed the sliver of shadow near the baseboard, a warped plank, the wood swollen from years of quiet neglect. She crouched, her knees aching, and pried it gently with her nails until it shifted, revealing a narrow cavity in the wall. Inside, wrapped in a strip of yellowed linen, was a book. Leather bound soft from handling edges frayed. She felt the weight of it before she saw the words. Her sister's handwriting was there, curling and precise, but not the sister she knew. These words were raw, frantic, written in the kind of hurry that comes when you dawn. The sound of the officers moving in the next room grew muffled, as though she were suddenly underwater. Margaret's pulse was loud in her ears. She turned one page, then another. Entries not dated but marked by weather. The morning the shadows stayed after sunrise. Somewhere below a door closed. The sound was final. Margaret didn't know it yet, but she had just stepped out of the world the police could search and into the one they couldn't. Margaret didn't move for what felt like minutes. She was still crouched on the bedroom floor, her hands tight around the diary, as if letting go might let something escape. The officers' voices drifted in and out from the hall, fragments of phrases, nothing here. Check the shed. Like lines from a conversation. She turned another page. The ink on this one was darker, fresher looking somehow, as though it had been pressed. There's someone in the hall again. I hear them at night. They don't knock. They wait. The handwriting trailed off into a faint scratch, the tip of the pen having caught on the page. Margaret's stomach turned, not in fear exactly, but in recognition. She had heard the floorboards at night too, once, maybe twice. And she'd told herself it was just the old house settling, the wind moving in. Struff footsteps approached. A shadow filled the doorway. Ma'am, the female officer's face was patient, careful. We're going to have a look around outside. Is there anything we should know before we do? Margaret hesitated. The words "my sister was afraid" rose in her throat, but she swallowed them. Saying them aloud would make them too real, too fixed. Instead, she just shook her head and let the officer leave the so. The house sighed again, that low, shifting sound from its bones. Rain tapped against the glass, slow and uneven, the way someone might tap a fingernail on a table, while she slipped the diary under her sweater, close to her skin. It was cold, but it seemed to warm against her almost immediately. She told herself it was body heat. She told herself it was nothing else. And outside she heard the metallic clink of the gate being unlatched, voices calling her sister's name into the blackness beyond the yard. Their shouts came back thinner, hollower, as though the night were swallowing them, while Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed, her sister's bed, and opened the diary again. The next page was more hurried, the lines, "If I don't." She read that line 3 times each time, feeling the weight shift inside her chest. It wasn't just something had expecting Mars somewhere in the dark. Outside, a dog began to bark, once then again, sharper, urgent. Margaret's hands tightened around the diary until her knuckles ached. The barking stopped as suddenly as it had started. The police came back in wet. Their jackets were slick with rain hair beaded with droplets that caught the light when they stepped into the hall. One of the men shook his head at the officer nearest the stairs, and though no words were exchanged, Margaret understood. Nothing the woman in the doorway said gently. "We'll expand the search at first light." First light. The phrase landed with a dull weight in her chest. It meant the hours until morning would be long, black, and empty, the worst kind of waiting. They left again, voices moving down to the kitchen radio, static crackling in bursts. She could hear them murmuring into it, code words and clipped sentences meant to sound official, but to her they just sounded tired. Margaret stayed upstairs. She didn't want the company of people who believed in search perimeters and scheduled returns. She wanted the company of her sister's last words. The diary lay open in her lap now, the spine curved into a shallow bow from years in hiding. Her fingertips brushed the edges of the pages, dry but not brittle. Preserved. Kept safe for someone. Another entry: they stand in the yard sometimes. I watch them through the curtains. I think they know I see them because they never move until I blink. Then they're gone. Margaret found herself glancing toward the window. The glass was a mirror now, reflecting her own pale face and the faint flickering hallway light behind her. Beyond that, just the black outside. She closed the curtains. Somewhere below, a chair scraped on the kitchen floor. A voice muttered something about maps. Another mentioned covering the creek. The creek was nearly a mile away, and yet hearing it said aloud, it sounded impossibly close. She returned to the diary. "The police came last week. I told them nothing. I think if I talk, I'll be seen. They don't understand, they can't see it. But I can." Margaret exhaled sharply, the way you do when you don't realize you've been holding your breath. The word, it was underlined twice. She read the sentence again, slower, almost mouthing the words. Upstairs had become very still. Even the rain seemed to have quieted. She thought of the search parties outside, walking with flashlights that cut thin beams through the wet air. She thought of their boots squelching in mud, of the way sound was eaten by distance in a place like this. And then she thought of her sister here, alone, hearing things she couldn't explain, hiding these thoughts in the walls. Her thumb traced over the underlined it. The diary felt heavier now. Downstairs, the voices were fading again, moving toward the door. Boots on the porch, the slam of it shutting. And then nothing. Margaret was alone in the house. The silence after the door closed was not natural silence. It had weighted density that made the air feel thicker. Margaret sat very still in the upstairs room, the diary open in her lap, the walls around her absorbing even the faintest sound. The house seemed to be listening, not passively, but with a patient kind of awareness, like someone leaning forward just enough to catch every word she might say. She didn't move for a long while. Her eyes drifted down to the page again. She'd left off on the sentence about it, but there were more words below she hadn't seen before. Her stomach tightened. They hadn't been there a moment ago. "If you found this, don't look out the window tonight." She froze. The ink was darker than the faded script above it, fresh. Or fresher than it had any right to be. She ran her finger lightly over the words, half expecting the ink to smudge, but it didn't. Her head turned slightly toward the window on instinct, and she stopped herself, forcing her gaze back to the paper. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Not loud, not rushed. Just the sound of weight shifting. Margaret's pulse quickened. She set the diary on the bed beside her and stood stepping lightly toward the door. She could hear the rain again now, faint against the roof, but beneath it there was something else. A slow, deliberate rhythm. A presence moving carefully, almost thoughtfully across the old wood downstairs. She pressed her ear to the doorframe. Nothing. When she returned to the bed, the diary was closed. Her throat tightened. She hadn't touched it. She hadn't even been near it. She reached for it, hesitating just before her fingers made contact. Her mind whispered that she should leave it close, the room walk away, pretend she'd never opened the thing at all. But another part of her, deeper and harder to silence, insisted she turn to the next page. The handwriting there was jagged now, less careful, almost as if the pen had been shaking. They will come to the door. Don't let them in, even if they say my name. Her mouth went dry. As if on cue, 3 slow knocks echoed up from the front porch. The knocks came again. 3 of them, evenly spaced. Not hurried, not desperate, but purposeful, like someone who already knew she would answer. Margaret's legs felt heavy as she descended the staircase, her hand sliding down the banister more for stability than habit. The old wood was cold under her palm. She could hear the faint hiss of rain spilling off the roof, and beyond it the low hum of the world holding its breath. At the bottom she stopped. From where she stood, the front door was just a shadowed outline against the dim light from the porch lamp. The glass panes in its upper half caught the glow in a way that made the outside seem brighter than it should have been. Another knock, softer this time. Her voice came out thin, almost uncertain. "Who's there?" A pause. Then in the stillness, a voice that made the hair on her neck rise. "Margaret, it's Thomas. Let me in." Her chest tightened. Thomas had been gone for 13 years. The voice was warm, steady, familiar, in a way that clawed at old grief. But there was something just a shade off, like an echo played back through an old tape recorder, just slightly warping at the edges. I can't, she said, her voice trembling. "You're not Margaret." The voice cut her off gently, almost pleading. "Please, you've been alone long enough." Her eyes flicked to the diary still in her hand. The page stared up at her with that jagged warning, "Don't let them in, even if they say my name." She backed away from the door. The porch boards outside groaned faintly, as though whatever was there had shifted closer. She could hear the soft tap of fingertips brushing against the glass. Then slowly the voice changed. It lost the warmth. It lost the pleading. And in its place came something deeper, quieter, almost amused. "You've already opened it, haven't you?" Margaret's stomach turned cold. Her mind didn't want to process what it meant, but she knew. The diary. The knocking stopped. The porch light flickered once, twice, and went out. The silence after the light died felt different, not empty, but watching. Margaret stumbled backward until her heel caught the rug and nearly sent her down. She didn't remember grabbing the phone, but it was suddenly in her hand, the dial tone buzzing in her ear. Her voice shaky and too loud. In the stillness spilled into the receiver, "There's someone at my door. I think they're pretending to be my..." The words dissolved. She couldn't bring herself to say husband. The dispatcher's voice came calm, measured, like she'd said these lines 100 times. "Ma'am, are you safe right now? Is your door locked?" "Yes," Margaret whispered, but the word felt like a lie. 23 minutes later, red and blue bled across the dark walls of her front room. The crunch of tires on wet gravel carried through the air, followed by the muffled thud of doors. 2 officers stood in the yellow beam of their flashlights, rain dripping from the brims of their hats. They moved with that mix of confidence and caution, reserved for late-night calls in quiet towns, part of them expecting nothing, part of them expecting the worst. "Evening, ma'am," the taller one said as she cracked the door. "We got your call?" "You said someone was outside." Margaret nodded, stepping back to let them in. The smell of rain and wet wool came with them. They knocked, said they were Thomas. But Thomas, her voice caught. The officers exchanged a quick look, the kind that speaks volumes without a word. "All right, "We'll take a look around," the shorter one said. They swept the porch first, no footprints in the shallow puddles, no sign of anyone in the yard. Out in the tree line, their beams of light vanished into the wet black. When they came back inside, they asked her to walk them through it again. She led them to the spot in the living room where she'd first heard the knock. The diary was still on the floor where she'd dropped it. One of the officers bent to pick it up. "Yours," Margaret shook her head. "It was here. When I came downstairs, I don't know where it came from." The man flipped it open casually and froze, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" the taller one asked. The officer didn't answer right away. He just turned the book toward his partner, showing a page scrawled in jagged handwriting. The ink warped and bled as if it had been written in the rain. "She will open it. She will hear the knock. She will call you. And you will find nothing." The taller officer closed the diary without a word. His jaw flexed once, twice. "We'll have someone do a full sweep tomorrow in daylight," he said finally. "For tonight, keep your doors locked. And if anything else happens, anything, you call us." She lay in bed with the lamp on the curtains, drawn tight, the covers pulled up to her chin, but her eyes never closed for more than a minute before snapping open again. Every creak of the house made her heart leap. The heater's pipes shifting, the wind finding a loose shingle, the faint tap-tap-tap of tree branches against the goot, only sometimes it didn't sound like branches. By 4:17 a.m., she gave up on pretending. She padded downstairs in her slippers, the wooden steps cold underfoot, and flicked on the kitchen light. The diary was still on the table where she'd left it, only now it lay open. She knew she hadn't opened it. She stood at the threshold for a long time, staring at the spread pages as though they might move if she waited long enough. The handwriting on this page was different, slower, more deliberate. "The first night is always the hardest. You will think you imagined it. They all do." Her skin prickled. She closed the book with more force than she meant to the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. By sunrise, the officers returned. Not the same pair from last night this time. It was a single deputy named Harland. His uniform was rumpled like he'd been pulled out of bed. "I walked the perimeter," he said, after 20 minutes. "Mud soft enough to hold a print. Didn't find any fresh ones." Margaret told him about the diary, about the new handwriting. She expected a smirk, a polite but dismissive nod, the way people react when they think stress is making you see ghosts. Instead, Harland didn't smile. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the book. He read the page once, twice, lips tightening as if he were counting seconds in his head. Then he shut it. "I'll run this by the chief," he said. But it didn't sound convincing. Margaret followed him to the door. "What do you think it means?" I think Harland said after a long pause. "You should make sure this place is never dark." That night, she kept every light in the house on. It didn't matter. At 2:04 a.m., 3 sharp knocks came from the front door. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocks didn't come again. But in the morning, she found the diary open on the counter, a new line waiting for her. She heard it. She did nothing. She's learning. The next day, she told herself it was because the hinges had started to stick, or because the cold air rushed in too quickly when it opened. But she knew the truth. She didn't want to stand in front of it. Didn't want to see that blank expanse of wood where someone had stood at 2 and she started entering and leaving through the side door by the kitchen. The curtains stayed closed now all day. Her neighbors, if they noticed, said the diary never stayed shut for long. She would close it, stack other books on top of it, and still find it spread open hours later. The handwriting changed with every new entry, some slanted and hurried, some so neat it looked like it had been copied from an old primer. But no matter the style, the ink always looked fresh. Always a faint gloss catching the light, and always written in the past tense. By the third day, Harlan returned. He didn't come with a search team, just him holding a thermos and looking like he hadn't shaved in days. "I talked to the chief," he said. "He's not sending more people. Not unless something concrete turns up." Margaret let him in. She didn't tell him the part that was truly eating at her, that the diary had already written down his visit yesterday in near perfect detail before it had even happened. He comes back alone. He thinks he can help. He cannot. She hovered at the kitchen counter while Harlan walked the downstairs rooms. He asked questions about locked doors, broken latches, missing possessions. The words felt useless in the air, like throwing a blanket over a pit. Then, without asking, he picked up the diary. "Is this from the house?" he asked. "Yes." He flipped to the first page. He frowned. This paper isn't new, but the ink is. She didn't tell him that she'd burned one of the pages in the sink 2 nights ago, and that the next morning it had returned unburnt, sitting exactly where it had been before. Harlan stayed until the light began to drain from the windows. "You're sure you haven't heard any?" Margaret thought of the scratching sound she'd heard from the upstairs hall last night, faint as a fingernail on wood. She thought of the whisper that may have been her name, or may have been the wind. "No," she said. He nodded. "Lock up, Margaret." She did. That night, the second knock came. It was softer this time. Slower. 3 beats a pause, then 3 again, like an echo repeating itself. She sat in the dark living room, the only light coming from the lamp in the corner. Her breath was so shallow it almost didn't exist. The knock came once more. And then something else. A sound from inside the house. From upstairs. She gripped the arms of her chair, nails biting into the fabric. The air felt dense, as if every shadow had weight. In the kitchen, the diary was open again. She didn't need to look, she could feel it. But she did. She hears the upstairs now. She will go. She will find it. Margaret closed the book and went upstairs. The stairwell felt longer than it had ever been. Each step gave a faint groan, the kind of sound that didn't just echo in the air, but seemed to hum in the wood beneath her feet, like something listening. She didn't turn on the hall light. It felt like if she did, whatever waited would vanish, or worse, be seen. At the top, the air changed. Colder, but not the kind of cold from open windows. This was stale mineral, like the inside of a locked trunk. The knocking had stopped. But she could still hear the other sound, a soft, deliberate shifting, something brushing against a wall. Her eyes landed on the guest room door. It was the only one fully closed. She hadn't set foot in there since the woman disappeared. She hadn't needed to. The police had cleared it after their search, leaving the bed stripped bare, the dresser empty, the air smelling of dust and cleaner. But now, the door wasn't just closed. It was latched from the inside. Margaret froze. She knew every lock in this house. That one could only be fastened from within. She stepped closer. The latch clicked slow measured, and the door swung inward a fraction. Her throat tightened. The diary was on the bed. Not the one from the kitchen. Another. Identical binding, same faded leather. Its cover was damp, as though it had been pulled from water moments before. The shifting sound stopped. Margaret's breath clouded in the dim light. She reached out not to touch the book, but to push the door wider. There was no one in the room. The bed was bare except for the diary. The dresser stood empty. The window was closed. But the smell, sharp, metallic, almost sweet, told her she wasn't alone. Her fingers brushed the book. It opened itself. She stands where the last one stood. She breathes the air she breathed. She will know now. The page shimmered faintly, as if the ink was still settling into the fibers. Her eyes moved down the lines, and her chest began to tighten. It wasn't describing her anymore. It was describing the night of the disappearance. Every detail matched the footsteps in the hall, the flicker of the porch light, the cold draft under the bedroom door. But then came something no one had told her, something the police never mentioned. She opened the door because she heard her own voice calling from the hall. Margaret's stomach dropped. Her hand trembled over the page. And then faintly from behind her in the dark hall, she heard her own voice, calling her name. She didn't turn at first. Her brain refused the command. Muscles locked, breath trapped in her chest. It was the kind of paralysis born from the oldest human instinct. If you don't move, maybe it won't see you. But the voice came again, softer this time. Closer, right at the shell of her ear. Margaret, come here. It wasn't just her voice. It was her voice layered with something else, like two people speaking in the same breath, one living one, from a place where air no longer moves. The book in her hand gave a single pulse of warmth as if alive. She turned. The hallway was darker than it should have been. Shadows didn't just pool, they bent, drawing her gaze toward the far end where the stairwell opened into nothing. And there, in the faint glint of the moon through the landing window, she saw a figure. Not quite solid, not quite light. The head was tilted at an angle too sharp for comfort, hair falling in slow motion as if underwater. It wore the same dress the missing woman had been last seen in, pale fabric, patterned with tiny blue flowers, but it hung wrong, like the body beneath it wasn't built for clothes anymore. Margaret stepped back into the guest room without meaning to, fingers gripping the edge of the diary so hard the leather creaked. The figure didn't move closer. It didn't have to. The air between them pressed inward heavy, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. She tried to speak, to say, "Who are you?" But her mouth formed the words without sound. The figure's head tilted further, and in that broken, gliding way, it began to raise its arm. It wasn't pointing at her. It was pointing at the diary. Margaret looked down. The pages had turned on their own. The next line was short. "Look outside." Her chest tightened. She told herself she wouldn't. She told herself it was a trap. But something, the same pull that must have drawn the missing woman, dragged her feet to the window. She pushed aside the curtain, and there, under the sick light of the porch bulb, was something that should not have been there. A shape, half in shadow, half familiar. And when it lifted its face, Margaret realized she knew it not from life, but from a photograph in the police file. The first woman who had vanished from this house. Margaret staggered back from the window so quickly her heel caught on the rug, sending her shoulder into the wall. The curtain swayed shut again, hiding the porch. But the image burned in her eyes, that pale, almost luminous face, the hollowness where the eyes should have been the faint, wrong smile. Her pulse was hammering when the first sound broke the suffocating silence, tires grinding to a stop on the gravel. She didn't even remember calling them the police, but she must have somewhere between the voice, the figure, and the porch. Her phone was still in her hand screen, glowing call timer, frozen at 02:17. Headlights swept across the living room through the front windows. Blue and red strobes followed, painting the walls in a disorienting pulse. The knock came heavy, official, shattering the spell. Margaret forced herself forward. Each step down the hallway felt like pushing through thick, unseen fabric. She glanced at the porch through the beveled glass in the front door. Nothing there now. Just the faint circle of moths around the porch bulb. When she opened the door, the night air rushed in, sharp and cold. Two uniformed officers stood there, one older, broad-shouldered, the other, young pale eyes darting toward the dark trees, as though expecting something to emerge. "Ma'am," the older one said, voice measured, "we got a disturbance call from this address." Margaret's mouth worked before sound came out. "She's here. Or she was." I saw her own voice faltered under the absurdity of the sentence. The older officer didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He just glanced at his partner and then back at her. "Can you step outside a moment?" She hesitated, fingers tightening on the diary. "Ma'am," he said again, softer this time, "please." The porch boards groaned under her bare feet as she stepped out. The cold hit harder now, and she realized with a prickling shiver that she could no longer hear the insects, the wind, or anything beyond the faint hum of the police cruiser's engine. The younger officer's flashlight beam cut through the trees, searching. "Show us where you saw her," the older one said. Margaret turned, pointing to the window upstairs, the one in the guest room where the diary had opened itself. She was there on the porch, Margaret said, her breath trembling. Then she wasn't. The beam of the flashlight swept across the porch boards at their feet, catching something. The younger officer crouched. Margaret saw his hand still for just a second before he said, "You'll want to see this." The older officer knelt, tilting the light. There, right at the edge of the first step, was a single wet footprint. Small, bare, facing the door, and the water it left behind was warm. The officers exchanged a glance, not the kind they meant for her to see, and the older one stood slowly. "All right," he said carefully, "let's have a look inside." Margaret's hand tightened around the diary. It was absurd she didn't even remember picking it up after she'd dropped it. But there it was, pressed hard against her ribs, like something that might shield her from the night. They stepped into the house, the door closing behind them, with a muffled thunk that seemed to make the silence inside even heavier. The younger officer's flashlight cut across the hallway walls, catching framed photographs, a half-open closet door, the slight sheen of dust disturbed by their movement. Margaret felt her own heartbeat too loud in her ears. "This way," she whispered, leading them up the stairs. Every step creaked in slow protest, and she thought just for a second that the rhythm of the creaks wasn't quite matching their footsteps. Like there was a delay, like something was following just far enough behind. The guest room door was still ajar. The flashlight beam spilled across the carpet, up the bedspread, over the writing desk. The diary still lay where she'd left it. Except the pages were different now. She froze in the doorway. The older officer noticed. "Mom," she didn't answer, just stepped forward, her breath fogging faintly in the chill of the room. The diary was open to the center now, both pages filled edge to edge with hurried handwriting. The pen she'd left hours ago sat exactly in the crease, as though someone had just set it down. Margaret reached out and touched the page. The ink was still wet. She whispered it before she could stop herself. "That's not mine." The younger officer came closer, leaning over her shoulder to read. His lips moved silently as his eyes skimmed the words. Then his expression changed, not fear exactly, but something tight, controlled, like a man keeping his breathing even. "What's it say?" the older officer asked from the doorway. The young one hesitated, then read aloud. "The first time I knocked, no one answered. The second time they opened the door, and I was standing there." Margaret's throat went dry. "The third time will be tonight." A sound from downstairs, faint, deliberate, 2 knocks. The older officer's head snapped toward the stairwell. The younger one froze, his flashlight beam shaking just slightly over the open diary. Margaret didn't move. She couldn't, her body had gone rigid, caught between the ice in her chest and the fire in her ears. "Stay here," the older officer said, already moving toward the hallway. His voice was steady, but there was an edge in it now, the kind that told you he'd stopped thinking this was just a welfare check. The younger one kept his eyes on the diary, even as he stepped back toward the door. "Ma'am, lock this behind me." But she didn't reach for the door. Her hand stayed on the diary, her fingers on the still damp ink, as if letting go would invite something worse. The sound came again. 2 slow knocks, not frantic, not hurried. Like whoever, whatever was there knew they could take their time. The older officer's boots hit the bottom step. Police department. His voice rang through the still air, but it felt muffled like the house itself was swallowing it. Identify yourself, silence. Then creak. A floorboard in the living room, directly under where Margaret stood. The younger officer's flashlight beam twitched toward the floor. "We've got movement," he called down. Margaret couldn't help it. She glanced to the window. The woods pressed close in the night, black branches like reaching fingers. But there between them, a shape. Still, watching. Not moving toward the house, not retreating. Just waiting. The older officer's voice came again, lower now. "There's nobody here." But Margaret knew that wasn't true. The diary was proof. The knocks were proof. And then, without warning, every light in the house went out. The younger officer cursed, fumbling for his radio. Static answered him, a deep, warbling hiss that didn't sound like any radio interference she'd ever heard. Margaret's own voice came out thin and shaking. "It's upstairs." The older officer reappeared in the stairwell's darkness, his outline barely visible. "We're all going outside. Now." But as they turned toward the door, Margaret saw it just for a heartbeat in the reflection of the hallway mirror. A figure standing behind them in the guest room doorway. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The figure in the mirror didn't move. It stood perfectly still, tall shoulders squared, face lost in shadow. But there was something wrong with the posture, something too straight, like it had been placed there. The older officer hadn't noticed. He had one hand on Margaret's arm now, ushering her toward the door. The younger one swung his flashlight toward the mirror, the beam slicing through the dark. Nothing. The guest room doorway was empty. But Margaret knew what she'd seen. And worse, she knew that for just that fraction of a second, the figure hadn't been watching the officers. It had been looking at her. They made it 3 steps toward the front door before the upstairs hallway erupted with sound of violent thrashing, bang, bang, bang against the wall, followed by something skittering across the floorboards like claws. Both officers froze. The older one muttered something low into his radio. It answered only with that same unnatural hiss. The younger one's flashlight shook again. What the hell was that? Margaret could feel her pulse in her teeth. "It's in the diary," she whispered, before she even realized she'd spoken. The older officer turned toward her, but before he could say anything, there came another sound, a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap from above them. Not from the hallway, from inside the ceiling. The officers exchanged a look, and the kind that said, "We're about to see something we shouldn't." The younger one moved first, raising his flashlight toward the attic hatch at the end of the hallway. The beam caught the metal latch, and in that instant, it began to turn on its own. The latch turned with an almost playful slowness, the faint scrape of metal on wood making the silence unbearable. Margaret couldn't move. Neither could the officers. It was as if the sound itself had pinned them in place. Then click. The attic door swung down with a dry, aching creak. The ladder didn't fall on its own. Instead, it slid down in a slow, jerking motion, like something above was guiding it, rung by rung. The younger officer raised his flashlight into the gap, but the light seemed to die there, swallowed by an oppressive darkness that felt too thick, too deep for such a small space. "Step back, ma'am," the older officer said. But his voice lacked conviction. Margaret didn't step back. She leaned forward. She didn't know why. Somewhere inside her, the dread was tangled with a strange pull, and the same pull that had led her to the diary in the first place. And then, the beam of the flashlight caught something. Not eyes, not a face, but the corner of a worn leather cover wedged between two attic floorboards, as though someone had tried to hide it but hadn't finished the job. The younger officer reached up, hand trembling, as he gripped it, tugging it free. A film of dust and fine white hair drifted down in the beam of light. Margaret couldn't tell if it was from an old rug or something that had once been alive. When he passed it down, the moment her fingers touched the cracked leather, the house changed. The air grew colder. The wood beneath their feet groaned, stretching like old bones. Somewhere beyond the walls, something shuffled away, retreating, but not in fear. More like it had gotten exactly what it wanted. The older officer stepped between her and the ladder. "We're done here. You need to get to a safe location for the night." But Margaret wasn't listening. She was staring at the cover. No title. No name. Just the faint impression of fingernail marks along the spine, as though whoever held it last had clutched it in panic. She didn't open it. Not yet. The attic above them was still open, still breathing. She didn't sleep that night. The officers had insisted on staying until dawn, taking turns pacing the hallway, radios murmuring static. But Margaret stayed in the kitchen, the diary on the table in front of her like an unexploded bomb. She didn't touch it for hours. She just listened. The house wasn't silent anymore. Now it had a pulse, a faint rhythm of creaks, faint enough to be dismissed as settling wood, but too timed, too deliberate. Every time she thought she heard something near the attic, the sound would shift. To the wall behind her, or the ceiling above, like it was following her without moving. At 3:12 a.m., she gave in. She pulled the diary closer. Her fingers left faint prints in the layer of dust, like she was disturbing something sacred. The leather was dry, but not brittle, holding a strange warmth, as if it had been pressed against someone's skin moments before it was found. The first page crackled when she opened it. No date, no greeting, just a single uneven line in smeared ink. "The house knows I'm leaving." Margaret's breath caught. The handwriting was cramped, jagged, as if written in haste. She could almost feel the writer's hand shaking. She turned the page. "It doesn't want me to. I hear it in the walls. I smell it in the dust. It doesn't care about the others, only me." She frowned. The ink here was darker, fresher looking, though that was impossible. Her fingertip brushed one letter and came away faintly blackened, like the words had been written recently. She read on each line, tightening something deep in her chest. "The attic is not an attic. I made the mistake of looking too long. The floor bends when I stand in the center, as though it's breathing. Sometimes when I lean close, it whispers my name back to me." Her throat went dry. The temperature in the kitchen had dropped without her noticing, her breath now faintly visible in the thin beam of moonlight. She turned another page. "If you find this, it means I didn't get out. It means the house won. Burn it. Don't sleep in it. And whatever you do, don't answer the knock after midnight." Her eyes darted to the clock on the wall. 3:47 a.m. The house groaned overhead, but this time it was different. Slow, deliberate, like weight was shifting in the attic again. And then 3 knocks. Not from the front door. From above. The sound didn't echo like wood being struck. It was deeper. Thicker. Like the noise came from inside the attic floorboards themselves. Margaret froze. She wasn't even sure she was breathing. The 2 officers in the hall heard it too. Their footsteps came, quick boots thudding over the carpeted floor. One of them muttered something under his breath, not protocol, not procedure, just the kind of small, unguarded words a man says when he realizes the rules don't cover this. The knocks came again. 3 perfectly spaced, not hurried, not panicked. They were patient. One officer called out, his voice deliberately loud, "Police. Identify yourself." Silence. Margaret stared up at the ceiling, every nerve in her body screaming. She could picture the attic ladder folded up in the narrow hallway, just 10 feet away, the thin string dangling down. The other officer, a taller man with tired eyes, glanced at her like he wanted to tell her something, but thought better of it. Instead, he pulled a flashlight from his belt. They moved as a pair, slow, deliberate, until they stood beneath the attic hatch. The taller officer reached up, grabbed the string. Margaret's voice cracked before she realized she was speaking, "Don't." The officers froze. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. She didn't know why she said it, only that something in her blood knew it was the right thing to say. The taller officer let the string fall. The little wooden end knocked lightly against the ceiling like a mocking echo. And then, without anyone touching it, the hatch shifted. Not much. Just a fraction of an inch. Enough for a seam of black air to appear between the panel and the frame. The smell came next. Not rot. Not mold. Something stranger. Like paper that had been wet for years, then burned halfway through and left to smolder in a closed room. Margaret staggered back, hand over her mouth. The taller officer turned his flashlight upward and caught movement, something pale pressed just behind the opening. Not a face, not exactly. More like the suggestion of one of the shapes where eyes should be the shallow curve of a mouth too wide. The beam flicked away, and when it came back, the shape was gone. Both officers swore under their breath. And then the diary, still on the kitchen table, snapped shut on its own. The officers didn't stay long after that. They didn't announce they were leaving, didn't even make the usual noises about following up or securing the property. They just left. One walked out the front door without looking back, his boots loud on the porch steps. The taller one lingered for a moment, his eyes moving between Margaret and the attic hatch, like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the language for what had happened. When the door closed behind them, the silence inside was worse than before. It was too complete, as though the house had drawn in a long breath and was holding it. Margaret stayed in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the diary. The leather cover looked darker now, as if whatever it was made of had soaked up something from the air. She reached for it, then stopped, her hand trembling. The thought was irrational, but she couldn't shake it. If I touch it now, it will be warm. When she finally forced herself to pick it up, it wasn't warm. It was cold. So cold it almost burned her palm. She sat at the table and opened it again. The handwriting inside seemed sharper than before, the ink darker, as though the words had been rewritten while she wasn't looking. The first page she'd read earlier, "They're here again," was still there. But underneath it, in smaller, almost frantic script, there was something new. "Don't let them open the hatch." Margaret's throat went dry. She flipped through the pages, her hands shaking harder with each turn. At first, it was just fragments. Sentences about shadows that don't match the light, and voices that move through the walls. Then, as the entries went on, the tone shifted from fear into something else. A kind of resignation. One page in particular made her heart thud in her ears. "If I go quiet, it's because they've taken the air." The words were smeared as though the ink had been dragged by a wet fingertip. Margaret didn't notice the time passing until she heard the sound, a soft, deliberate scrape coming from directly above her head. The attic. She closed the diary. And for the first time since she'd stepped into the house, she realized the scraping was in rhythm. 3 slow strokes. A pause. 3 more. Like something or someone was carving. Margaret didn't move at first. She sat frozen at the table, the diary clutched in both hands, like it might shield her from whatever was above. The scraping continued. 3 slow strokes. Pause. 3 more. The sound was faint, but clear as if whatever was making it knew she could hear and wanted her to. She thought of the attic hatch. The police had closed it, but they hadn't locked it. And even if they had, would it matter? Her eyes drifted down to the diary. The page she'd just read, the one about the air, was different now. There at the very bottom was a new line, so faint she almost missed it. Don't watch. The room seemed smaller, the ceiling lower. The scraping went on now, accompanied by another sound, something soft and intermittent, like slow breaths measured and deliberate filtering through the wood. Margaret tried to convince herself it was the house settling. Old timber warped nails. But deep down she knew. Settling wood doesn't breathe. She rose to her feet. Not because she wanted to, but because standing felt safer than sitting there beneath it. Each step toward the attic hatch felt like moving deeper into the house's throat. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, thick waiting. And then, just as she reached the center of the hallway, it came a knock, not above her head, not on the hatch, but inside it. One knock, followed by a slow, deliberate dragging sound toward the hatch's edge. The diary slipped in her grip. When she caught it, the book fell open, not to where she'd been reading, but to the very last page. A single sentence stared back at her, written in ink so black it seemed wet. Answer it. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat. The word answer it seemed less like a suggestion than a command that had been waiting for years to be heard aloud. Margaret's hand rose almost without her willing it. Her fingers brushed the narrow string that dangled from the attic hatch. It was cool to the touch, not dusty, not brittle like it should have been. Another knock came, this one sharper, close enough that the wood beneath her hand seemed to throb from it. She pulled. The hatch creaked downward in one long, reluctant motion, and with it, the ladder unfolded, each rung settling into place with the weary groan of metal that hasn't been touched in decades. She expected the darkness above to be absolute, but it wasn't. Somewhere in the far corner, a dull amber glow pulsed faintly, as though something hidden was breathing light in and out. The air was heavier up there, thick with the smell of damp earth, though the attic had no contact with soil. And under that smell, faint but unmistakable, came something sweeter, almost metallic. Margaret climbed. The first rung flexed beneath her weight. The second felt firmer. By the third, she realized the house had gone utterly silent. No night insects outside, no shifting timbers, as if the entire world had paused to listen. At the top, she steadied herself, her head just breaching the opening. She expected clutter, forgotten boxes, old suitcases. Instead, the attic was almost empty, except for one thing. In the far corner beneath the faint pulsing light was another diary, identical to the one in her hand. But its cover was pristine, no dust, no wear, as though it had been placed there minutes ago. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She stepped up fully into the attic. The ladder groaned under her departure, retracting half an inch as if it didn't want her to come back down. The diary in the corner seemed to hum faintly, a vibration she felt more in her bones than in her ears. She knelt, and just as her fingers brushed its surface, a shadow moved across the wall, not from her, not from any light source she could see, and a voice close and low whispered from directly behind her, "It's yours now." Margaret froze. Her breath clouded in front of her, even though the attic was warm a second ago. That voice, the closeness of it, was wrong in a way her mind didn't have a name for. She turned. Nothing. No one. Only the raw slant of the attic roof beams, blackened with age, the faint drip of water somewhere it shouldn't be. But the diary was warm now. Alive warm. She held it, thumb pressing into its spine. The leather gave under her touch as if it had skin beneath it. And then, not a second later, the first line appeared across its first page. Not in her handwriting. Not in ink she recognized. "They'll think you found me too late." Her stomach lurched. Margaret stumbled backward, almost losing her footing. That was when the ladder rattled not from her movement, but from weight. Someone was climbing up. She clutched the diary to her chest, her mind racing with the impossibility of it. The police had gone home hours ago. No one else should be in the house. Then the head of Officer Beale appeared in the hatch. His face was flushed from the climb, but there was something else there too. Confusion cut with suspicion. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. "You didn't tell us there was a second one." Margaret swallowed hard. I didn't know." He stared at the diary in her hands. Not the way a man stares at an object, but the way a man stares at a snake he can't tell is dead or alive. "That wasn't here when we searched," he said slowly. "I looked. Right in that corner." She wanted to say, "I believe you," but the words caught in her throat. Beale climbed all the way up his boots, thudding softly against the attic boards. He didn't touch the diary, didn't even reach for it. Instead, he shone his flashlight toward the far wall. The beam cut across something that made Margaret's stomach drop, faint scratches in the wood, like someone had been keeping tally. Not days or weeks, years. The air pressed heavier around them. Beale's eyes narrowed. This isn't just a missing persons case anymore. And before she could ask what he meant, the first page of the diary turned on its own. The paper made no sound when it turned. No crisp crackle, no whisper of friction, just the quiet certainty of a thing that wanted to be read. Beale's light caught the new page. The handwriting was jagged, now pressed so hard into the fibers that the letters carved shadows. He's still in the walls. Margaret's chest tightened. She couldn't move, couldn't even swallow. Beale stepped closer, and the wood beneath his boots gave a groan so deep it seemed to travel through the bones of the house. He glanced at her. "Did you hear the sound came again?" Not groaning wood this time. Something else. A drag. Slow. Deliberate. Beale's hand went to the grip of his flashlight as if it were a weapon. "Stay here." He angled toward the far wall, the one with the tally marks. Margaret didn't want to be alone. Not up here. Not with the attic pressing down like a coffin lid. She followed anyway, the diary still warm in her hands. Beale ran his fingers over the marks. They were deep. Not the casual scratching of boredom, but the carved patience of someone measuring time in captivity. Then just beneath the last mark, something shifted. A seam. Barely visible. He pressed it. The panel gave, not with the brittle resistance of old wood, but the reluctant sigh of something built to be opened and closed again and again. A draft curled out, cold, damp, and wrong. Margaret's eyes watered. The smell was metallic, almost like blood, almost like rust. Beale looked at her. In his face, she saw the same realization. She felt this wasn't the first time someone had been in here. The panel creaked wider, and from the darkness beyond, something fell. Not big, not loud, just enough to make her step back, a thin ribbon of paper curling at the edges like it had been clenched in a fist for decades. It landed at her feet. Margaret bent her fingers trembling as she picked it up. A photograph. Black and white, blurry but clear enough to see the outline of a woman at the edge of the frame, a woman in a dress she recognized. Her own mother, 30 years younger, standing exactly where Margaret was now. And in the shadow just behind her, a man's hand. Margaret's throat closed around the breath she'd been holding. She couldn't tear her eyes from the photo. It wasn't just her mother's dress. It was the look on her face caught mid-turn, startled as though she'd just heard someone behind her. And that hand, pale strong, its fingertips pressed into the fabric of her shoulder like it had been there for a long time. Beale took the picture from her without asking. He studied it in silence, his jaw tightening with something that wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite fear. Then he reached into the hollow behind the panel. His flashlight beam vanished inside blackness so deep it seemed to swallow light. For a long second, there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Then the faintest scrape. He pulled something out. Not one thing, but a bundle, a mess of papers bound together with frayed twine, the edges warped from damp. When he set it down, a cloud of dust and a smell like old mildew rolled into the attic. Margaret's fingers itched to untie it. But Beale stopped her. "Not here," he said low. "Not yet." Before she could ask another sound, froze her where she stood. A knock. Downstairs. Not the polite rap of a neighbor. Not the impatient thud of an officer returning from outside. 3 slow, deliberate strikes. Wood on wood. Beale's head turned toward the attic stairs. He flicked his flashlight off, and in that sudden darkness, Margaret's heartbeat sounded like footsteps in her ears. The knock came again. Exactly the same. Measured. Patient. Then silence. So complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. They waited. And just when she thought it was over, the front door creaked open. The attic seemed to shrink around them as the sound bled into the house. Margaret's pulse was a drum in her throat, her fingers still curled around the bundle of papers, like it was the only solid thing in the world. Beale motioned for her to stay behind him. They moved toward the stairs without speaking, the floorboards sighing under their weight. Every creak felt too loud. Every shadow felt like it leaned toward them. Halfway down, Margaret could see the hallway, a narrow tunnel of darkness, lit only by the faint spill of moonlight from the open front door. The air was colder down here, damp in a way that made her skin prickle. The smell of the night outside was sharp metallic, like rain on rust. The door wasn't wide open, just cracked a sliver enough to see the black ribbon of the porch beyond. The silence after the knock was almost worse than the knock itself. It had weight. It was expectant. Beale stopped just short of the threshold, his hand hovering over the handle of his sidearm. Margaret, clutching the bundle to her chest, felt a strange pull toward the gap in the door, as if someone was standing on the other side, waiting for her to look. She leaned just far enough to see past Beale's shoulder. Nothing. The porch was empty. The street beyond was a still frame. No movement, no sound. But the shadows along the hedgerow seemed thicker. Beale nudged the door open with his boot. It swung inward with a sigh, and the night pressed in. They both listened. From somewhere far off, or maybe just inside her own skull, came the faintest, almost inaudible rhythm. 3 beats. Slow. Measured. Beale stepped onto the porch, scanning the street. Margaret stayed in the doorway, hugging the bundle tighter. The twine bit into her fingers, and then she realized the papers weren't cold anymore. They were warm, almost feverish. Margaret didn't even notice she had stepped backward into the hallway until the door clicked shut behind Beale's return. The house swallowed them again. No streetlight, no movement. Just the heavy stillness of wood and plaster that had been standing for decades. Her hands were trembling. Not from the cold, from the heat of the diary pressed against her chest. Beale's eyes dropped to it. "Let's see it," he said, voice low. But there was a tightness there, the same kind of caution a man uses when he's not sure if a thing is safe to touch. Margaret hesitated. Her thumb found the edge of the brittle twine, feeling the tiny phrase the way the knot had fused slightly over time. It didn't feel like an object that had simply been forgotten in an attic. It felt like something left behind deliberately. The knot gave after a slow pull, the twine uncoiling with a dry whisper. The top sheet was thicker than paper, almost parchment-stained at the corners. She unfolded it, and a scent rose up, not dust, but the faint, unmistakable tang of something organic like old leaves rotting in a sealed jar. The first page wasn't even a diary entry. It was a name, written in ink so faded it looked like it had been pulled from the paper itself rather than applied. Just one name. Margaret didn't recognize it. But the way it sat there, centered underlined twice, made her throat tighten. She flipped to the next page. A date. October 14th, 1982. The handwriting changed, smaller, tighter, as though whoever had written it had been trying to get the words down before they slipped away. I heard them again last night. They're closer. I can hear them breathing when I wake up. Margaret's fingers paused on the edge of the paper. The attic above them creaked just once. A long, low bend of timber. Beale's eyes met hers. Where exactly did you find this? She swallowed, but her voice came out thin. Under the insulation, wrapped in a sheet of black plastic, like it wasn't supposed to be touched. Beale didn't move for a moment, and then with a glance up toward the ceiling, he said, "We're not alone in this house." Margaret didn't breathe as she turned the next page. The handwriting had grown jagged now, as though the pen had been pressed so hard it tore the fibers beneath. I woke up at 2:17 again. This time the window was open. I don't remember opening it. I closed it, but when I lay back down, I heard the floorboards in the hall. Just one step, then nothing. I think they're waiting for me to move. She felt the air in the room shift, that strange, unplaceable pressure that comes when the weather changes or when someone is standing just out of sight. Beale stepped closer, peering over her shoulder, his breath barely audible. Margaret whispered, This is the night she..." But Beale's hand shot up. "Shh." From somewhere deeper in the house came the faintest sound. A tap. Not a creak, not a gust of wind through old walls, a deliberate hollow tap. It came again slower. 3 beats, evenly spaced. Margaret's knees weakened. It wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from the locked basement door. Beale's jaw tightened. "That door's been bolted from the inside for 30 years, he murmured. Margaret clutched the diary tighter, the paper crinkling in her grip. She could feel it, the same dread that must have lived in the person who wrote these words. A terror that didn't come all at once, but dripped in. Night after night. Until you couldn't tell if it was in your head or already in the room. Beale stepped toward the basement door. Margaret stayed rooted in place, her eyes falling back to the next diary entry, one sentence written in uneven strokes. "If they knock, do not answer." And in that second, the knocking began again. The sound didn't just echo, it seemed to inhabit the air. Margaret's ears caught every fiber of it, the hollow wooden pulse sinking into her ribs. Beale's flashlight beam skimmed across the basement door. The paint was cracked, curling in flakes, but the bolt, a thick iron bar across the top, hadn't moved in decades. Still, the wood shivered faintly with each knock. Margaret's eyes were locked on the diary. The next line, written in frantic downward slashes, "They wait for the quiet. They wait until you think you're alone." Her breath was tight, shallow. In the dim light, she could see where the ink had bled from the pressure of the pen, where the author's hand must have been shaking. Beale whispered, "It's just the pipes. Old house." But even he didn't sound convinced. The knock came again, softer this time, almost curious. Margaret turned the page with trembling fingers. The entry was short, almost a scrawl. "Do not open the door for the second knock. It is not them anymore." The words hit her like ice water. She hadn't even realized she'd been counting one knock, now two. The second knock was different. Not hollow, not wood on wood. It was skin. Beale's light caught something on the base of the door. Faint scratches in the old paint. Deep grooves. And just beside them, 3 small, dark stains. Margaret clutched the diary like a shield. We shouldn't. But before she could finish, the third knock came. And it wasn't on the door. It was behind them. The third knock was so close, it seemed to vibrate through Margaret's spine. She spun the beam from Beale's flashlight, skittering across the basement wall, catching brick shadow dust motes, but there was no one there. The diary slipped a little in her grip. Pages trembled under her thumb as though the paper itself were cold. Somewhere deep in the house, a board creaked, slow, deliberate, as if weight had shifted. Beale's jaw was tight now. We locked this place back up, he said, but his voice was quieter than it should have been, almost like he didn't want the house to hear. Margaret turned another page. The handwriting was sharper now, carved into the paper as much as written on it. When they come in threes, you have already answered. You just don't know how yet. She swallowed. This isn't just someone writing nonsense, she whispered. It's her words died. Because just then the sound came again. Not a knock this time, but a faint dragging like fingertips brushing along the wall behind them. The beam of the flashlight shook as Beale swung it toward the sound. The wall was blank brick, no seams, no openings. But the noise continued sliding toward the far corner, then vanishing as if it had gone inside the wall itself. Margaret felt the air shift colder, denser the way a room feels when someone has just stepped into it unseen. She looked back down at the diary, and the words seemed to pulse. In the dim light, I can hear them moving. But it's not the walls they're inside. It's me. The floor above them groaned. And for the first time since arriving, Beale's hand went to the gun on his hip. Margaret's breath had slowed without her noticing, shallow, measured, as though she were afraid the house might hear it. Beale's eyes kept flicking upward toward the ceiling, tracking every muted shift in the old wood above. This place isn't stable, he muttered, but it was clear his concern wasn't about the building. Margaret turned another fragile page. The ink bled into itself here, letters clawing for space on the paper. It's late. They told me not to open the door after midnight. But the knocking won't stop. If I don't answer, I think they'll come in anyway. Her pulse kicked. She glanced toward the dark mouth of the staircase, half expecting to see someone standing there in the half-light, waiting. Beale took a slow step closer. What's in that thing? Margaret didn't answer right away. She was already slipping, not just reading, but feeling into the moment the diary described. The basement faded. The words weren't just on the page anymore, they were around her. She could hear the knocking faint at first, then sharper, more impatient. A hallway formed in her mind, wallpaper peeling a thin strip of light under a door at the far end. The diary's ink deepened under her gaze, each letter pulling her deeper. I can see a shadow in the glass. It's taller than anyone I know here. When it moves wrong. Her hand tightened on the paper. Beale's voice was distant now. Margaret. The smell hit her, faint but unmistakable old rainwater and scorched dust. She was no longer sure if she was standing in the present or in her room the night the woman vanished. Another knock. Only this time. She knew it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from directly behind her. She turned. The basement walls seemed to stretch, pulling into the narrow proportions of that imagined hallway. Margaret could still feel the gritty concrete under her shoes, but her eyes told her she was standing on faded floral carpet, the kind that muffled sound and smelled faintly of mildew. She blinked, and for a heartbeat, She saw her own hands, present, older, steady, holding the diary. Then she blinked again, and the hands were younger, thinner, trembling under candlelight. The knocking was louder now, deep and resonant, as though the wood itself was straining to hold back whatever was on the other side. Her chest tightened. "They're not leaving the diary," whispered in her mind. "And I don't think they're alone." Beale's voice came again, sharper. Margaret snapped out of it. But he sounded far away, like he was speaking through water. Her gaze slid toward the thin strip of light at the door's base. Their movement. Feet. Not still, but shifting their weight, impatient. And then, like a breath escaping between teeth, the faintest scrape against the wood. Followed by another, higher up. Like fingers. She could feel the air in the hall grow heavy, pressing against her skin. Something was wrong with the light under the door. It was dimming, as though a shadow was rising, covering it entirely. A voice, low, almost conversational, drifted through the wood. Not words she could understand, but syllables that seemed to burrow into the back of her skull. And then, the knock. A single, deliberate knock. From inside the room with her. She turned so fast the diary nearly slipped from her hands. The candlelight in her mind sputtered. The walls bled back into the bare basement, the air thick with dust. But she wasn't alone. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound hadn't been imagined. It had weight, vibration, and the faint, hollow resonance of knuckles meeting wood in a small enclosed space. Beale had gone still beside her, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the workbench, eyes scanning the shadows. He didn't ask if she heard it. His stillness meant he had. Margaret's mind raced, basement door locked, no one else in the house front door chained. The possibilities thinned to nothing logical. Her fingers tightened around the diary until its cracked leather edges dug into her palms. The lamp on the bench gave off a frail cone of light, leaving the far corners of the room in syrupy darkness. The knock came again. Slower this time. 3 deliberate beats. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission, it announces. Beale moved toward the noise, his boots crunching softly on the dust. Margaret wanted to tell him to stop, to let it pass, but the words stuck like thorns in her throat. Her gaze dropped to the diary in her hands, and she realized the page she'd been reading was no longer blank. Fresh ink bled into the fibers, words writing themselves in a looping, uneven hand. Don't open it. Don't look at its face. The basement seemed to contract around her, the shadows thickening, pulling closer. Somewhere between the lamp's dim halo and the door's edge, she thought she saw a shape, not fully formed, but waiting. The silence stretched until she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Then, with a sound like someone drawing a fingernail along a coffin lid, the knock came a third time. And something on the other side whispered her name. Beale's hand hovered over the latch, his breath slow and controlled, but his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't calm, he was measuring. Margaret forced her voice to work. Don't. It came out quieter than she intended, like a child afraid of waking something. He glanced at her over his shoulder. Margaret, if someone's down here, they're not. She cut in. Her knuckles whitened around the diary. Not in the way you think. The wood under the latch gave a faint, impatient creak. The thing, whatever it was, didn't knock again. It waited as though it had heard their exchange and was deciding how to answer. A faint smell seeped through the cracks in the door. Damp earth. And underneath it, something faintly metallic like coins warmed in a closed hand. Beale's jaw tensed. We open it on 3. No. 1. The diary twitched in her hands. Not her imagination, it moved. A ripple went through the cover like skin flinching at a touch, and her breath hitched so sharply she choked on it. The words on the page were changing again, the loops and slashes dragging themselves across the paper like something carving with a blade. "Behind it you'll find the rest of me." She backed away instinctively, but Beale was already throwing the latch. The door swung outward in a single motion, revealing not a hallway, but a narrow black-walled shaft. No floor, no stairs. Just a void that breathed cold air up into their faces. From below, somewhere deep, deep down, a sound rose, half scream, half laughter, and the smell of wet soil thickened until it coated her tongue. Beale swore under his breath. Margaret could only stare. And in her hands, the diary's pages fluttered wildly, as if something inside was trying to get out. Beale staggered back, one hand braced against the wall, as if the darkness itself had shoved him. The shaft exhaled again, that slow, damp breath, thick with the scent of rotted leaves and iron. It was the smell of something that had been buried too long, now suddenly disturbed. Margaret's instinct was to slam the door shut. Every inch of her body screamed for it. But her eyes refused to break from the void, because down there, impossibly far, something moved. Not a person, not an animal. It shifted wrong like a shadow cast by no source. Beale found his voice. "This isn't on the plans," he said, as if the absence of blueprints made it somehow less real. Margaret didn't answer. She was watching the shaft, but she was also hearing something in her own head, a murmur she couldn't place. Words not spoken aloud. She looked down at the diary. The pages had stopped fluttering as though satisfied now that the door was open. One sentence stood stark across the paper ink, still wet, "They hear you too." The murmur in her skull sharpened, and she realized it was two voices overlapping. One male, one female, both whispering in an urgent conspiratorial tone. But she could only catch fragments. 30 years. The same night. Don't look at the walls. Beale leaned over the edge, shining his flashlight into the abyss. The beam barely cut 10 feet before dissolving into absolute black. I think I saw his light hit something. A flash of white-like fabric far below. And then, just for a second, there was a face. Margaret yanked him back so hard the light smacked the doorframe. It was gone. The murmur in her head dropped into a single unbroken sentence, the two voices now in perfect unison. "Close it before they notice you." She slammed the door. The latch fell into place on its own. Silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It felt aware. Beale looked at her as if he'd just realized she knew more than she should. What exactly is in that book? Her hands tightened on the diary. Not what she said. Her voice was steadier now. Who? Beale's decision came fast, too fast, Margaret thought. "We're taking that book back," he said, as if speaking loudly would steady him. "Whatever's in it, the department can get it analyzed, carbon-dated hell, even blessed if that's what it takes." Margaret hesitated, fingers still hooked into the leather cover. The diary felt heavier now, the way a locked drawer feels heavier when you know what's inside. "You won't get it to the station," she said quietly. Beale snorted. "Why not? Because it doesn't want to go." Her words hung in the air like a bad smell. Beale laughed under his breath, but it wasn't genuine, and they both knew it. He reached for the diary anyway. The moment his fingertips brushed the cover, the air between them shifted. It was as if every sound in the room, and the faint hum of the hallway light, the ticking of the radiator, even the rush of their own breath had been sucked out. They were in a vacuum. Then, in that heavy silence, came the first sound, a knock. Not from the hallway, not from the door. From inside the wall directly behind Margaret. Beale froze mid-reach, his hand still an inch from the diary. The knock came again, a slow, deliberate rap. And then another lower down the wall. Someone was moving inside there. Beale's voice dropped to a whisper without him deciding it. There's no crawl space behind that. Margaret stared at the wall. No, she said, there isn't. The knocking began to travel, moving along the plaster toward the window, and then down toward the baseboard, as if mapping the perimeter of the room from within. Margaret backed away until her spine met the opposite wall of the diary clutched to her chest like a shield. Beale, pale now, tried the rational approach. Could be pipes. No pipe, she said, moves with intent. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Because the next sound wasn't knocking, it was a voice, muffled by plaster, strained and distant but clear. Bring it back. Beale looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the authority in his eyes cracked. What is that? Margaret's throat tightened. She didn't answer him because she'd heard that voice before. Not here. Not in this year. It had been on a cassette tape decades old in a case file everyone had forgotten. And now it was speaking to her through the wall. Beale didn't say another word for nearly a full minute. He just stood there, eyes locked on the wall like he expected it to breathe. Margaret set the diary down on the desk between them. You think I'm crazy? She said, her voice low but steady. He shook his head, but it wasn't denial. It was the slow, reluctant motion of someone crossing a threshold they'd spent years avoiding. I've been a cop 23 years, Beale murmured. I've heard people screaming through walls, through floors, through vents, and I've never once thought it could be someone who wasn't alive. He paused. Until just now. He bent over, pressing his ear against the plaster. Nothing. The wall was dead silent again. Then he straightened, unholstering the small field recorder he carried. If it speaks again, we'll have it on tape, he said almost to himself. Margaret was already moving not toward the door, but toward the one locked cabinet she'd never opened in front of anyone. The key hung on a nail inside the closet. It turned with a small metallic click. Inside a jumble of cassette tapes, each in its own plastic sleeve, each marked with case numbers in her sharp, thin handwriting. She pulled one out, the one she'd been thinking of when the voice spoke. A missing person case from 1979. A dark, stubby woman in her early 20s. Checked into this very building when it was still a boarding house. Never checked out. The tape was all they had left of her, a recording made by another tenant who claimed they could hear her through the walls the night she disappeared. Most dismissed it as a hoax. The audio was distorted, garbled by old equipment and the thin plaster between rooms. But there was one moment, one clear fragment of speech that had haunted Margaret ever since she'd first played it. She slotted the cassette into the battered player on her desk, hit play, and they both listened as the static filled the room. A faint shivering sound under the hiss breathing. Then a single phrase, "Bring it back." The exact same cadence, the same strained pitch, the same impossible distance as what they'd just heard through the wall. Beale's hand moved to the recorder in his pocket again, not to turn it off, but to check that it was still running. His eyes flicked toward the diary like he was seeing it for the first time. That thing he said didn't just come from this room. It's still in this room. Margaret swallowed hard. And it knows I have what it wants. Beale didn't argue. Instead, he said the one thing she'd been dreading and hoping to hear. Then we find out who's been waiting for it all these years. The dim light from the battered desk lamp flickered as Margaret and Beale spread out the aged floor plans between them. Yellowed with time, the creases ran deep, but the layout was unmistakable. The very bones of the boarding house, frozen in ink and dust. Margaret traced a finger along the thick black lines, pausing at the basement level. "Look here," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "There's a space they marked as storage, but it's bigger than any closet. See how it extends behind the walls of the main rooms?" Beale leaned in and squinting. "That's where the shaft is, isn't it?" "Exactly." Her eyes lifted to his. And if someone disappeared here in '79, if the voices on that tape belonged to her, then this house isn't just a building. It's a trap. Beale's fingers drummed on the table. Traps don't just spring themselves. Margaret nodded, the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. Someone wanted to hide something. Or someone. A cold breeze slipped through the cracked window, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, thin, fleeting, and impossibly distant. Beale swallowed hard. "We're not just chasing ghosts, are we?" "No," Margaret said, closing the diary gently. "We're walking right into their shadow." The room felt colder as Margaret and Beale dug deeper into the case files scattered across the desk. Pages of typed reports, brittle newspaper clippings, and faded photographs, each one a fragment of a life erased. Margaret's finger hovered over a grainy black and white photo of a young woman, her face, pale eyes, wide lips pressed tight. "She was only 23, Margaret said softly. "Stayed here for 2 weeks. Everyone said she was quiet, kept to herself. Then one night, she just vanished." Beale flipped through a folder thick with police notes. No sign of forced entry. No footprints outside. Just gone. Margaret's gaze drifted back to the diary on the desk. The words still echoed in her mind, haunting and persistent. "They hear you too." Suddenly a knock at the door jolted them both. Slow, deliberate. They exchanged a glance, hearts pounding. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps. Beale moved cautiously toward the door hand on his holster. Margaret clutched the diary tighter, feeling its weight like a lifeline. When Beale opened the door, no one stood there, only a chilling breeze that swept through the room, carrying with it a whisper, "Bring it back." The door creaked shut behind Beale, but the chill lingered, an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Margaret's eyes never left the empty hallway as the whisper curled around her like smoke. "Bring it back." She shivered, not from cold, but from the weight of those words sinking into her bones. Beale closed the door, his face, tight eyes shadowed with the same dread she felt. "Someone's watching," he muttered. "Or maybe waiting." Margaret nodded, her fingers tightening on the diary's worn cover. This isn't just a missing person case anymore. It's a warning. Together, they returned to the scattered files, the room now humming with a restless energy, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for the next secret to surface. Outside, the night pressed close, thick with silence, and something darker still. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever, each second stretching thin like a wire about to snap. Margaret flipped through the brittle pages of the diary again, the faded ink revealing new fragments of a fractured mind. They come when the night forgets its own name. I hear their whispers through the walls, the floor beneath my skin. I'm losing myself. But if I don't hold on, they'll take the rest of me. Beale's voice broke the silence. This woman, she wasn't just scared. She was trapped. Margaret swallowed hard, the weight of the past pressing on her chest. The shaft, the knocking, the voices. It's like this place is alive and hungry. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes like fingers tapping impatiently. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into shadows that danced and writhed along the walls. Beale reached for his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness, to reveal a new message scrawled hastily on the back of the diary's last page. Don't trust the silence. They never left. Margaret's heart hammered as the room seemed to breathe around them, a cold, invisible presence tightening its grip. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows flickering, as if breathing alongside them. Margaret's fingers trembled as she held the diary open, the chilling words etched across the page burning into her mind. Don't trust the silence. They never left. Beale swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking in. This isn't just a building. It's It's a tomb. A sudden creak echoed from the floor above, sharp and deliberate like footsteps, pacing slowly in the darkness. Margaret's gaze snapped upward, heart hammering against her ribs. The attic hatch rattled softly, as if someone or something was trying to get out. Beale moved toward the stairs, gun drawn, but hesitant, every step heavy with dread. "Stay here," he whispered. But Margaret was already following, drawn by a force she couldn't resist, a need to confront whatever had been waiting in the shadows for decades. As they climbed, the temperature dropped, and the air thickened with an ancient, stale scent like forgotten memories and sealed secrets. At the top, the attic door loomed like a silent sentinel, the darkness beyond swallowing the weak glow of their flashlights. Margaret's breath caught. The diary pulsed faintly in her hands, as if alive, guiding her closer to the heart of the mystery. The final knock sounded soft, but unmistakable, echoing through the house like a summons. The attic door groaned as Beale pushed it open, the air inside stale and heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something darker, old secrets long buried. Margaret's flashlight swept over forgotten trunks, yellowed photographs, and tangled cobwebs hanging like veils between the rafters. At the far corner, a small wooden chest sat half-hidden beneath a moth-eaten blanket. The leather diary pulsed faintly in her hands, as if urging her forward. Beale's voice broke the silence. This is where it all stopped. Margaret knelt, brushing dust from the chest's cracked surface. A rusted lock hung open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, fragile threads of a past no one had dared to unravel. She unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was the same as the diary's, shaky but unmistakable. "If you find this, know that I was never truly alone. They came for us all, one by one. The house, it's a living nightmare, and the shaft is its heart." Beale swallowed hard. The shaft, the disappearances. It's all connected. Margaret nodded, eyes locked on the words that had brought her here, the final warning from a voice lost in time. A sudden chill swept through the attic, and the faintest whisper stirred the shadows. "Bring it back." Margaret's fingers trembled as she traced the faded ink of the letter once more. The weight of its words settled heavily in the room, pressing down like the thick dust that blanketed the attic's forgotten corners. Beale stepped closer, his eyes scanning the shadowed rafters, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the darkness. "The shaft," he murmured, voice tight with dread. "It's the key to everything. The disappearances, the voices, the fear." Margaret swallowed hard, the diary's pulse growing faint but insistent in her hands, as if guiding her toward some unspoken truth. Outside, the wind rattled the attic window, carrying a soft, haunting echo, 3 slow knocks, deliberate, as if counting down to a final reckoning. Beale's breath hitched. "We don't have much time." Together they moved toward the trap door that led back down, but just as Beale's hand reached the latch, the faint whisper rose again, clearer this time, "Bring it back." The attic seemed to close in around them, shadows lengthening like fingers reaching out from the past, beckoning them into the abyss below. Margaret met Beale's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them, and there was no turning back. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into absolute darkness. Margaret's heart pounded like a drumbeat in the silent attic as she grasped the worn rungs, the cool metal biting into her palms. Beale followed close behind his flashlight, cutting a narrow beam through the thick blackness below. The air grew colder, heavier, charged with a presence that seemed to watch, waiting. With every step down, the walls seemed to close in their rough surfaces, slick with moisture and the faintest trace of something metallic, blood perhaps, or rust. At the bottom, the beam caught a small carved symbol etched deep into the stone floor, a twisted spiral that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat beneath their feet. Margaret's breath caught. This was the heart of the house's nightmare, the shaft the letter warned about. Suddenly a whisper curled around them, soft but unmistakable. "Bring it back." Beale's voice was barely more than a breath. This is where it started. And where it ends. Margaret nodded, clutching the diary close. In this suffocating darkness, with the past pressing down like a weight, the final truth waited. The shaft seemed to exhale, inviting them in, and there was no turning away now. The walls closed in like a tomb as Margaret and Beale stepped deeper into the shaft's suffocating darkness. Each breath was shallow, the cold air tasting of damp earth and forgotten sorrows. The faint echo of their footsteps bounced off unseen stone, swallowed almost instantly by the void. Margaret's fingers tightened around the diary, the pulse beneath the leather growing stronger as if it held the very heartbeat of this cursed place. Ahead, the beam of Beale's flashlight flickered over something glinting in the gloom, 3 small objects arranged carefully in a triangle. She knelt, eyes widening with dread. 3 tiny silver lockets, each etched with a delicate initial, A, B, and C. The triplets. A shiver coursed through her as the whisper returned, no longer distant, but surrounding them. "Bring it back. Bring them home." Beale swallowed hard. They were never gone. Not really. Margaret's voice was barely audible. "The house kept them, and it's been waiting all these years." From the shadows, a soft movement stirred, almost a breath, almost a sigh. The past was alive here, watching, waiting, and in that moment, the weight of everything lost pressed down, an unbearable truth aching to be set free. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, as if the shaft itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Margaret reached out, her fingers trembling, and lifted one of the lockets. Cold metal, worn edges, a faint warmth pulsing beneath the surface, as if it still held a flicker of life. Beale's flashlight flickered violently, then steadied, casting long, trembling shadows that danced along the rough stone walls. A whisper rose again, clearer than before. No longer a distant murmur, but a voice filled with desperate longing. "Find us. Free us. Bring us back." Margaret's heart clenched. The triplets were gone, yes, but not lost. They were trapped, caught between the world they left and the darkness that claimed them. The diary throbbed in her hands, pages fluttering open to reveal a final chilling message. Only when the lockets return can the silence be broken. Beale's voice was low, almost reverent. "We have to finish this." Margaret nodded, tears blurring her vision. The weight of years, the sorrow, the mystery, the unanswered questions, was about to be lifted or buried forever. Together, they prepared to face the darkness that had waited 3 decades to be confronted. Margaret took a steadying breath and slipped the 3 lockets into the folds of the diary. The cold metal seemed to hum faintly against the worn leather, as if awakening something long dormant. Beale shone his flashlight up the narrow shaft, the beam cutting through the shadows, to the ladder that led back to the attic. "We bring them back up," he said softly, "and maybe this nightmare ends." As they climbed, the walls seemed to pulse, heartbeats sinking with the diary's steady thrum in her hands. The whispers followed them upward, a chorus of longing and regret, fading into a fragile silence. Reaching the attic, Margaret placed the diary and lockets on the dusty floor. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We bring you home." The house shuddered, a long, low groan, reverberating through the beams. For a moment, the air was thick with sorrow. And then, as if a weight had lifted, the oppressive darkness began to fade. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale gold through the attic window. Margaret opened her eyes, feeling the warmth of the new day settle around her like a benediction. Beale smiled, a weary, hopeful smile. "It's over." But Margaret knew some shadows never fully disappear. They simply wait patient, watchful, for the next time the silence breaks. The soft light spilled across the attic floor, illuminating the diary and lockets resting quietly in the dawn. Margaret reached out her fingers, brushing over the worn leather cover, feeling the echoes of years past seep through her skin. Beale stood nearby, his gaze distant but steady, as if watching the shadows retreat one final time. "This story," Margaret whispered, "it's not just about what was lost, but what we choose to remember." The house, once suffocating and alive, with unseen whispers, now seemed to exhale, releasing its hold on the past. Outside, birds began their morning songs, a tentative promise of hope amid the lingering mystery. And though the triplets were gone, their story, their restless souls, had finally found a voice that would haunt the halls no longer with fear, but with remembrance. As the sun rose higher, the shadows faded, but the questions remained. Who else might be waiting in silence? What other secrets lie buried beneath the surface of forgotten places? The diary closed softly, its final words etched not just on paper, but on the hearts of those who dared to listen. In the silence, we are never truly alone.